All right, continuing on in 9.7, we are looking at an example of how to find the inverse of a 3 by 3 matrix. So we're going to be taking our matrix and we're going to augment it with the identity. And then we are going to use Gaussian elimination to get the identity on this side. And then whatever we end up with on this side is going to be our inverse. So that's going to be the strategy whenever we're trying to find an inverse of a 3 by 3 matrix. So our first goal is going to be to get this to be a 1. And so what the book did is the first thing they did is they switched row 1 and row 2. So they switched row 1 and row 2. And then first I just want to mention that there are many ways to do this. Just because the book went with a certain strategy doesn't mean that's the strategy that you need to use. You could have just divided the whole thing by 2. But obviously this way avoids fractions, which is nice. But there's many ways to do this, and you'll end up getting to the same answer eventually. Okay, so again, switching row 1 and row 2, and then multiplying row 2 by -1, and then adding it with row 1. So if I make this into a -2 and I add it with this 3, I'm going to end up with a 1, right? So I'm going to multiply this by -1 and add it with row 1. So once I've done that, I end up with this row. So notice that we've started changing this side over here. It's no longer the identity. It started to change. It just so happens that I end up with zeros here. That wasn't my goal in this step. It's just a nice thing that ended up happening. That means that we'll have fewer steps because we're not going to have to go back and make these zeros later. We've essentially already finished this row. So but either way, the next thing that we would want to do would be to get a 0 here or to get our zeros over here. So really the next thing we want to do is to get a 0 here. So the first thing that they did was they multiplied again the second row by -1 and added it into the third row. So they multiplied this by -1 and then added them together and put it in the third row. I don't know why they put it in the third row. I would have just put it in the second row because then they went ahead and then they switched rows. Not sure why they did it that way. Possibly it made some of the arithmetic easier later on to do it that way. But so that's either way is fine. So multiplying this by -2, or -1, or you can multiply this by -1, so that these cancel each other out. And so they got this row, and then they switched these 2 rows because you want the 0 here. So you get this row, and then this row is now down here. And now our next goal is to get this to be 0. So we multiply the top row now by -2 so that these are opposite, right? Top row by -2, add them together and put them in the third row. So that's shown here that's what they did. And you end up with this row here. So now we have our 1, 0, 0. So this column is done. So generally, then our next thing that we would do would be try to get this to be 1, but it's already 1 because some nice arithmetic worked out, and this is already 1. So now our next goal is to get this to be 0. Get this to be 0. So you're going to multiply this row by -3 to get these to be equal and opposite. So multiplying this by -3 and adding them together. And it just happens that that ended up making this 1 a 1. If that hadn't made this 1 a 1, then that would be our next goal, would be to get this to be 1. And then we would want this to be 0, get that to be 0, and get that to be 0. So this worked out really nice. It was fewer steps than these often end up being. But basically, the order that you want to do it in is get this to be 1, get this to be 0, get this to be 0, get this to be 1, get this to be 0, get this to be 1, and then go back up here, get this to be 0, this to be 0, this to be 0. So that's kind of the order that you want to go in. It's the most efficient order. And then now that this side is the identity, this side is the inverse, which is what we were looking for. So we got our inverse here. All right, hopefully that helps, and I will see you in the next video.